The news conference of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, live from Washington.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, between rich and poor, between young and old, in this country and around the rest of the world.
Union leaders weren't the only ones out of touch with their rank and file. So was the Democratic Party. In 1968, Robert Kennedy was poised to be the Democratic nominee in that year's presidential election. He wanted to expand civil rights and social programs. He wanted to pull the U.S. out of the Vietnam War. Young people flocked to his banner. It looked like he had enough momentum to get elected president. But he was assassinated a few months before the election. President Lyndon Johnson, who had a deep hatred for Kennedy, saw this as his chance to get his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to the top of the ticket. He assumed Humphrey would continue his policies, including staying in Vietnam. This put him on a collision course with the young Democratic voters, who wanted Eugene McCarthy, the guy who took up Robert Kennedy's mantle. In the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, young Democratic voters came out in support of McCarthy. Lyndon Johnson, who was still president and still had an iron grip on the Democratic Party, made sure they couldn't come inside their international amphitheater where the convention was being held. Inside, he worked behind the scenes to get Humphrey the nomination. Once nominated, Chicago police, under orders from Mayor Richard Daley, an ally of President Johnson, violently broke up the crowd of young people outside. This scene replayed on news broadcasts around the country. Everyone saw firsthand how out of touch with its base the Democratic Party had become. The Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, won the election by promising peace with honor in Vietnam, a phrase that sounded like he wanted to pull out of the war, but really meant nothing. Despite this drama, Humphrey nearly won the election with the support of America's labor leaders, especially George Meany, the head of the American Federation of Labor. The AFL was sort of a super union, a coalition of different unions from industries all over the country. Meany could be counted on to turn his members out in the millions to vote on Election Day. This made him a major power broker in Washington, and perhaps the true backbone of the Democratic Party. It was Meany's endorsement that nearly won the election for Humphrey in 1968. But it wasn't enough. The Democrats stuck by the labor unions, much like the UAW stuck by the Treaty of Detroit at Lordstown. But in both cases, a new, very active generation was challenging the old way of doing things. Then, in 1970, this new generation got a boost with the passage of the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which lowered the voting age to 18. If they were old enough to go off to die in Vietnam, they were old enough to vote in elections. The Democrats were determined to bring these new voters into the fold. They wouldn't repeat the mistake of 1968. Enter the modern presidential primary. Political parties were used to choosing presidential candidates at their national conventions, which usually took place the summer before the election. The stereotype was that party bosses from around the country would smoke cigars in a private room and negotiate until they could find the one candidate everyone could agree on. They then presented their candidate to the convention, who would give an acceptance speech to galvanize the party. In many cases, the candidates who came out of these smoke-filled rooms were people who didn't offend anyone, which is why so many presidential candidates throughout history were dull and uninspiring. But the Democrats asked, what if the voters got to decide who the candidate was? What if Democratic presidential hopefuls went state to state and faced off in elections where registered members of the party got to vote on who they wanted representing them? That way, the party would choose the most popular candidate and wouldn't need the police to beat up their own voters on national television. This was the start of the modern presidential primary. Whoever they chose as their candidate in 1972 would be the first candidate in American history to be chosen through this process. And that man turned out to be George McGovern, a senator from South Dakota. Like Robert Kennedy, he vowed to end the war in Vietnam. Like Robert Kennedy, he vowed to expand civil rights for black people and women. And he had an idea designed to appeal to the working classes: a basic guaranteed income of $1,000 to every American, what he called a demo grant. He took his ideas and his speaking skills into the Democratic primaries. There were two other Democrats who gave him stiff competition. One was Hubert Humphrey, the man who lost in 1968. He was the darling of the old labor union power brokers like George Meany. Then there was George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who was the darling of old racist Southerners, the one group who had supported the Democratic Party since the days of Andrew Jackson. Wallace would be shot and confined to a wheelchair early in the primaries, but he stayed in the race. It wasn't clear whether this would hurt him or gain him sympathy votes. It was clear that Wallace had a lock on the former Confederate states. Instead, McGovern focused on winning the Midwest and Northeast, the industrial heartland of America. You would assume we would have trouble beating Hubert Humphrey there since he was the labor union GOAT. Instead, he had much more trouble beating Wallace, especially in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, which were big labor union states and far away from the South. What was going on? Wallace wasn't offering anything to American workers. He certainly wasn't guaranteeing $1,000 a year like McGovern. Nothing he promised would put more money in workers' pockets. He was offering the usual Southern segregationist racism. And yet, white workers in these northern states voted for him in high enough numbers to worry McGovern. Even though McGovern ultimately won the primaries and became the Democratic nominee, he was rattled by Wallace's popularity. In hindsight, he was right to be rattled, since it was a bad sign for the future of the Democratic Party. After winning the first ever Democratic primaries, he went to the National Convention in Miami expecting to be named the party's nominee for president in 1972. The convention that year looked much different from the one held in Chicago in 1968. All the people who were left standing outside in Chicago in '68, the hippies, the women, the African Americans, were inside in Miami in 1972. The people who were inside in Chicago in 1968, labor leaders like George Meany, were also inside in Miami in 1972. And they didn't appreciate sharing the space with these new young Democratic activists. There they were, the old guard of the Democratic Party, mostly male, mostly white, mostly older, chomping on their cigars, alongside the new guard of the Democratic Party, a younger, more diverse group hoping to bring the party in a new direction. Meany was not happy. He tried to prevent the convention from nominating McGovern, hoping to get his man Humphrey in on technicalities. After all, he had always been part of the smoke-filled rooms who chose presidential candidates. Why should it be any different this time? He wasn't going to surrender the Democratic Party to a bunch of liberal hippies. But he had no choice. The people had already spoken. McGovern gave his acceptance speech to the convention. Now he was ready to challenge President Nixon in the general election in November. But Meany remained salty. He could not accept the fact that the unions had lost control of the Democratic Party. He refused to even endorse McGovern in the election against Nixon. The AFL not endorsing the Democratic candidate? That was unheard of. He sat this election out. Richard Nixon and the Republican Party breathed a sigh of relief. Come election day, Nixon won over 60% of the popular vote and 49 out of the 50 states. It was the biggest landslide election in American history. If the Democrats were cooked in 1968, they were barbecue chicken in 1972. What in the world had happened?